I worry about sort of a homogenization of institutions across countries. So I think the way our epidemiologists, I think we failed, in the public health response, similar to the way Western Europe failed, right? And I think there's just everything, from the way we organize our economy to the way we organize, our government. I mean, you look at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where I think we tried to sort of import, like, not even the American Constitution, but like a 21st century, what American Constitution would look like with like gender quotas in Parliament and stuff like that. And the sort of best practices model of development, where we try to we sort of have this idea of what societies should be, and we try to just incentivize it or push for it to the greater extent possible. I see that as somewhat of a existential risk to humanity, because there could be a problem where you need some kind of if we're all going to end up, if we have some major challenge and we all sort of look the same, and there's there's sort of this across institutions, we could fail in the exact same way and we could all be in trouble. So I guess for the way I look at it, I'm glad US and China are like so different, that there's these two superpowers and they're not just like sort of carbon copies of each other. And I like to see more diversity more generally across the world. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's something I'm sympathetic to, but I don't think is actually going to happen. I suspect so. In the Mark Andreessen interview he did with what, like 6'3" Balkan war criminal,
Yeah.
he mentioned that over the next 50 years, everybody's going to get weird in the Joe Heinrich sense, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, because America media is dominant and will continue to dominate over the next 30, 50 years. Right. Even though like American power projection in terms of military authority is down, I mean, we saw countries like New Zealand have Black Lives Matter parades, and New
Yeah.
Zealand is not known for having a lot of black people or for really, right. They treated their indigenous people not great, but they didn't really have slaves. They didn't have any of this long history of um, brutalism that the U.S. had, and so it shows this cultural hegemony that I suspect is relatively entrenched. And with the new medium of the internet, right, this cultural hegemony is going to, right, like going to continue as the internet continues to eat the world. And so, because of that, like China as a old civilization, as a rapidly industrializing power that has enough authority to resist, is one thing. You see, kind of what might be described as like, I don't know, like tacit like resistance in some places, like I don't know, right?
Macron's war on a left wing campus culture.
Yeah, you have that. You also have like Japan and South Korea, where there's this kind of facade of Westernism, but there's this really deep culture underneath. You have Orban, who's really kind of attacking liberalism. So you do see some of these, I don't know, like outposts. But my feeling is that the general trend that's been the last like 20 years is likely to continue. And I do know some people who are working on charter cities, and sometimes they call them charter cities, sometimes they call them other things, explicitly with this like institutional revival perspective, like we're going to plant the seeds for a new civilization, blah blah blah. And I'm pretty skeptical of that. Like it's I I tend to think that we should focus most of our efforts on kind of reforming existing institutions. And the way I see this is right. The current dominant like narrative is basically the wokes, and what needs to be done. You won't win in a head-on fight with them, but what you need to do is basically to create a new idea, a new culture that can peel off the next generation of elites and create identity and values around that. That can end up kind of taking over governing institutions in the U.S. And elsewhere, that can then put forward a much more positive pro humanity vision. And that idea I see as probably like progress studies or something in that general vein. And so if I think about what, like, I don't know, institutional revitalization looks like, it's right creating a entire movement around progress studies similar to the progressive movement that ends up having substantial influence on American and other institutions and is really embedded in the basis of our thought. And so instead of first thinking like, how does this affect the environment or how does this affect than of race relations or gender relations. It is, does this lead to more innovation and better living standards for people? And having that be the baseline. And I don't know if and perhaps I'm just being overly optimistic. I'm not sure it's possible, but I don't think creating a new breakaway civilization is possible either. So I'm choosing to focus my efforts on revitalizing what we have.
Yeah, I think your comparative advantage is not necessarily to revitalize Chinese civilization. I think yeah, you're an American, you're American, and yeah, I think you're doing what along the lines of what you should be doing. As far as the ultimate triumph of Americanism, I think it depends. I'm not as sold as it's sort of that predetermined. I mean, by conservative economic projections, in 30 years, China will have 2 or 3 times the economy. It's not a very charming country to most of the rest of the world, but a lot of things depend on whether systems are perceived to succeed or fail. Like communism once had a wide appeal to elites all over the world, and the system just didn't work right. And so I think a lot will depend on how functional America is seen over the next few decades, and whether China can keep up their growth. And it doesn't mean there's going to be a scenification. Everyone's going to become speak Chinese and try to be like the Chinese Communist Party. But it could get people thinking, maybe there's other ways to do things. I think that's also possible.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think like the relative decline of America will definitely threaten American prestige. I just think the American entertainment complex is so advanced. I like the Chinese might be catching up in 20 years, but they'll still be behind. I think that the U.S. entertainment complex is still going to be like pretty dominant over the next 20 years, probably over the next 30. I think the one interesting point that you did mention is that the withdrawal of American, like I don't know, power is going to leave basically regional power vacuums that are going to lead to the rise of much of institutional forms that have a lot higher diversity than the ones that we're currently accepting and engaged in.
Yeah, about American cultural power. I looked into this recently. So someone had said, so I was thinking about Orban in Hungary. I just looked up like the top 10, 20 highest grossing movies in Hungary, and they were like all American movies, right? They were like
Yeah.
18 American movies. But then I looked at China, and they were actually all Chinese movies, right? So there does seem to be, a difference, and I think you get the same thing with India and Bollywood. My family's from the Middle East; they watch Turkish and Egyptian Turkish with dubbed sort of movies and like soap operas, and Egyptian too. So you do have sort of these cultural, even
Do you
racial
think
barriers. People who look like themselves, they want to see themselves on the screen.
do you think they're
Uh,
watching more or less than they were 20 years ago?
they're probably, they're certainly probably watching more American stuff, but I had satellite, Arabic satellite TV in my house when I was growing up, and I've done a study abroad in Russia, so I have limited experience abroad. So I did study abroad in Russia, and a lot of the cartoons, a lot of the things on TV would be dubbed just American stuff, right? But the Arabic satellite TV, which I have experience with, you wouldn't see that. I mean, it was all just they would have like their version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, so there was this kind of cultural diffusion. But they're a different culture. I mean, the way they like an American talk show about like relationships is not going to translate there. So that's the Middle East, and I think the cultural distance between the West and China, I think is even larger. So like if you look at the top 20 grossing movies in China, the last few years, maybe they're watching more American movies, but it's like one instead of what used to be zero.
Oh, sure. And so I don't think the U.S. is going to culturally dominate China, right? They one can put up right barriers to movies. I think they currently do have barriers to like amount of films that can be shown, and they have a sufficiently large internal market to develop a good like their own internal movie industry. What I am kind of predicting is that U.S. movies are basically probably going to dominate the rest of the world. And I think China, which is the only real competitor, is not going to seriously compete in terms of like broad cultural influence. And so the test for this is to look at like Latin America, Africa, Middle East, India, etc. Like how many movies, like what media do they consume today? What percentage of that media is American versus indigenous versus Chinese? then to look in 20 years, what percent is American indigenous versus Chinese. My guess is that in those regions, America either stays the same or grows over the next 20 to 30 years, while China will probably grow, but not nearly as large as America. And indigenous, depending on the region, either grows or stagnates or falls.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I want to make clear, I don't think Chinese media is going to have much appeal
Yeah.
to most of the rest of the world. So yeah, that's not what I think. But I do think with development, I do think you can see indigenous. I think you could do. It's possible you do because it's like you're at a level of development. You don't have any movie industry, you don't have any TV industry at all. What your lowest movie development, and then as you rise up a little bit, maybe you get things more catered to your local tastes. I think that something like that has happened with the Nigerian movie industry. Something like that happened with the Indian movie industry. Yeah, definitely don't think it's all going to be Mandarin Chinese. I think it's a basic human thing that Americans don't want to watch a movie that's set in China with all Asian characters. I mean, they want to see things that they can relate to and people who look like themselves. And I think there's a reason that American movies dominate Europe in a way that they don't dominate East Asia.